Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. And the topic of the day, you don't need me to tell you, people, college football is back. College football is back in a big way. That is right. Saturday, week 0. And listen, I know that on Friday's show, I kind of poo-pooed week 0. We need more big games, all that. But once the games kicked off, they were awesome. And there is obviously only one place to start, right? It is Dublin, Ireland, the game we spent a ton of time talking about on Friday's show. Georgia Tech, Florida State, a 10.5-point favorite. I said bluntly, this felt like a total stay away to me. Two pseudo-erratic quarterbacks in DJU and Haynes King. What side do you take? I'm just staying away. Well, I bring it up because it was a little quirky. It was a little bit different, but it delivered in a way that college football always does, as Georgia Tech, 10.5-point underdog, walk-off field goal. First game of the year, knocks off the 10th-ranked Florida State Seminoles. Before we even start breaking down this game, let me start by saying this. All offseason, we spend so much time talking about the positives, the negatives of college football. NIL, portal, is it out of control? This 12-team playoff, do we like it? Do we not like it? Well, guess what? Once the games kick off, this sport always delivered, and it is no exception, as in quite literally the first game of the year, we get a top 10 upset as Florida State falls. So let's go ahead and dive in. Obviously, look, we could start with Georgia Tech, and it's no disrespect, but the story here is Florida State. We'll get to Georgia Tech in a minute, but we're not one of these shows that you always have to start with the winning team. No. As I always say, as my buddy Colin Cowherd says, we are in the interesting business, and seeing Florida State as a top 10 team lose is certainly the more interesting part of this story. Now, before we get into it, got to give the preface, got to give the disclaimer, if you will. Yes, I understand that this is a 12-team playoff era, and we don't need to overreact. Florida State could lose this one. They could lose in a week from now. They could lose in a month from now. They could be 9-3 or 8-4. But if they get to Charlotte for that ACC championship game, if they win the ACC, then they're not only in the playoff, but they're a top 4 team in that playoff. So obviously, any of these games early in the season, they just don't have the same meaning that they did even a year ago. Okay, and by the way, it's not just Florida State. It's going to be the same for next week. If Clemson loses to Georgia, or if LSU loses to USC, or if Texas A&M loses at home, I get that. But at the same time, as I look at that game for Florida State, I think it was really bad. And I think there are some big picture concerns that you got to have if you're a Florida State fan. And I think the big picture concern that, in my opinion, is very clearly going to follow this team all season long is that they kind of got punked at the line of scrimmage. And it's wild because you go back to our preview on Friday's show and why I just couldn't get excited about Florida State. I'm not a huge DJU guy. Not a knock, not trying to criticize, not saying he's the worst person that's ever walked the face of the earth. But as a college football player, he's been inconsistent. He's been erratic, 57% completion percentage last year at Oregon State. But the one thing that I figured is that whether I like DJU, whether I don't like DJU, is that at the very least, they would be so good in the trenches that it wouldn't matter how good, maybe in one game a year against Clemson or Miami or whatever, maybe you need DJU to make a play. But this Florida State program, as Mike Norvell has built it, has been dominant in the trenches. 2 years ago, led the ACC in rushing. Last year, you go back, you think about how dominant both the O-line was, but also the D-line, Braden Fisk, Jared Verse, Patrick Payton, who's obviously back this year as well. And so that was the shocker. I can't blame DJU. And if you're a Florida State fan tuning in, I promise I am not blaming DJU, because what was the shocker of all shockers was how Georgia Tech just dominated the line of scrimmage. Opening drive, Florida State marches down the field, scripted plays, whatever. After that, Georgia Tech just absolutely got after it. I mean, the stats are kind of stunning when you look at it, okay? Because here's the bottom line, is that we knew that Florida State was really good last year and that there was a possibility that they could take a step back this year. But Georgia Tech last year, you understand they had the 120th ranked total defense in all of college football out of 133 FBS teams? By the way, 128th in rush defense. So you'd think at the very least, Florida State beats them up, runs it all over them. They'll be fine. They'll figure it out. Maybe they're not perfect, but they got plenty of time. They're going to win this game, whatever. Instead, it was Georgia Tech that looked like they got the dudes up front that are going to potentially lead them to potentially a special season in the ACC. Bottom line, just look at the stats, okay? On offense, Georgia Tech running against a Florida State defensive line that, again, lost a lot, but they still got NFL dudes up front. 190 yards rushing for Georgia Tech, 5.5 yards almost per carry for the Yellow Jackets. Now, they ran the ball well last year, but 5.5 yards per carry against Florida State, that is big time. But I think as impressive was what that defensive front did to Florida State. Florida State, listen, they lost some guys, but they got a lot of experience on that offensive line. I believe the stat is like 60-plus starts for their 5 offensive linemen as college football players. Well, did you see what Georgia Tech did to them? They held them to 98 yards rushing, about 3.2 yards per carry, 7 TFLs, right around 300 yards of total offense. But here's the crazy part, 290 yards of total offense in total. Take away the opening drive when Florida State marched down the field, 7 plays, 75 yards. Florida State had 216 yards of total offense in that game. And if you take out the 2 big booming field goals, I mean, their field goal kicker was the best player on that team on Saturday, and it's not enough. And I think for me, that's my concern with Florida State, is not that they're terrible, not that they can't bounce back and potentially compete for the ACC championship. And again, if you make the ACC championship, if you win the ACC championship, you're in the playoff. But the bigger concern is, look at this schedule. Why are we to believe that they're just going to suddenly be able to just dominate both lines of scrimmage? Play Clemson by the end of September. By the way, the game at SMU, I don't think is a gimme. SMU, we'll see. But at SMU, not a gimme. Clemson, a week later at home. Then you got Miami the end of October. North Carolina's got dudes. You got Notre Dame on the road. So all of a sudden, if Georgia Tech did that to you, why are we to think that Notre Dame can't do that to you? Frankly, that Florida can't do it. I could criticize Billy Napier to the high heavens. Florida, they at least play hard. They're not always disciplined, but they play hard. So you look at Florida, you look at Clemson, you look at Miami. This is a concern. And listen, I know it's not all on DJU, but I do think the pseudo-conservative play calling, that probably helped Georgia Tech, is that it was pretty clear that Mike Norvell did not want to challenge Georgia Tech deep for the most part, wanted to keep DJU's throws and reads short intermediary, and that just allowed Georgia Tech to creep up and creep up and creep up. And that's where I would be concerned, is why is it going to get better? By the way, I do have one other thought on Florida State, and this is not a tear down Florida State thing. I know we want to overreact. I know it's week 0. I get all that. But at the same time, I was thinking about this, and I did tweet it during the game. This is kind of the gift and the curse of the portal, right? Is that Florida State has not been an elite high school football program, or a high school football recruiting program. Last 3 recruiting classes, 12th in the country, 19th in the country, 20th in the country. But they have nailed their portal evaluations, and credit to them. But at the same time, when you look at portal recruiting, the portal is going to give, the portal is going to take away. There's going to be years where there's a ton of talent and you're going to get your fair share. There's going to be years where there's a ton of talent and you don't get your fair share. And there's going to be a lot of years where there just isn't as much talent and there are more things that you need to replace. And that's kind of was a concern of mine with Florida State coming into this year, is that they're not Georgia, they're not Ohio State, they're not whoever, even Alabama, that has so much depth because of the high school recruiting that even when you lose a lot, you got guys that are ready to go. And so you look at Florida State, I think what this is, they have nailed the portal recruiting, and maybe the talent just wasn't as good in the portal this year, whatever. But I do think this is the gift and the curse, as I said, of portal recruiting, because you just never know who's going to be available, who isn't, who you're going to get, who you're not. And then all of a sudden you're scrambling to fill important roles on your roster every single season. Now, really quickly, before we get out of here, and by the way, I'll do the caveat one more time. Florida State fans, if you're mad at me, that's fine. plenty of time to bounce back. You get Boston College next Monday. By the way, that is that Labor Day Monday night game, Boston College at Florida State. So we'll see if it gets any better. Really quickly, got to give credit to Georgia Tech. You look at Georgia Tech and you look at this program, and this has been a program that has not been good for a very long time. You don't need me to tell you that. I get it. But Brent Key takes over last year, was the interim for the back half of the season before, gets them to 7-6. And this is a program that is very clearly trending in the right direction. By the way, I'm far from a high school football recruiting analyst, but the recruiting class is starting to look good. They have a 5-star offensive tackle already committed for 2025. The other guy we got to give credit to is Haynes King, man. I've been critical of Haynes King through the years. He's far from perfect. Make no mistake about that as a football player. But this was a guy, everybody got their cheap shots in with him when he was at Texas A&M. And I think we're starting to realize that maybe a lot of that was on Jimbo Fisher, because this guy was improved last year. This game in this game against Florida State, he wasn't incredible. He wasn't amazing. He wasn't the best quarterback that has ever walked planet Earth. Nobody's mistaking him for Patrick Mahomes. But 11 of 16 passing, 146 yards, couple big rushes, 54 yards rushing, about 4 yards per carry. So credit Georgia Tech. Now, listen, the one thing I'm not going to do from the Georgia Tech perspective, I want to give them credit, but that schedule is really tough that they have. They play at Georgia, or they play Georgia State at home next weekend, then at Syracuse, at Louisville to end September. And so you're talking about 3 games outside of Atlanta in their first 5 games of the year. Still have Notre Dame on the schedule. Still have to go to a good Virginia Tech team. Have to go to Georgia, obviously, in your rivalry game, and get Miami at home. So it is a brutal schedule. I think ESPN listed it as like one of the 5 toughest schedules per analytics. Doesn't change the fact, though, that they get the win. They deserve the credit. Congrats, Georgia Tech fans. But again, I think there's a lot of questions that Florida State